Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about how Yacob and Heywat attempt to use their reason to support their faith or belief in the existence of God, using what has now come to be known as a cosmological argument. So in this video, we're going to look at the argument in Yacob's own words from his treatise. Then in considering how to develop this argument, we're going to consider a question of how should we create a picture of the universe that we live in. And this is going to lead us to the beginnings premise and then the principle of causation. These are the two pieces that are going to come together to make the entire argument for the existence of God. After looking at and motivating the argument, we'll then consider some objections and some possible responses. So let's take a look at the argument in Yacob's own words. So this passage comes from the Sumner translation that we've been working with and comes right after Yacob has raised doubts about the existence of God and asked himself, does God really exist? And he says, well, later on I thought of the words of the same David. Is the inventor of the ear unable to hear? And I said, who is it that provided me with an ear to hear? Who created me as a rational being, and how have I come into this world? So there's this question of what brought him into being? What caused him to exist? Where do I come from? Had I lived before the creator of the world, I would have known the beginning of my life and of the consciousness of myself. Who created me? Was I created by my own hands? But I did not exist before I was created. If I say that my father and my mother created me, then I must search for the creator of my parents and of the parents of my parents, until they arrive at the first, who are not created as we are, but who came into this world in some other way without being generated. For if they themselves have been created, I know nothing of their origin unless I say, he who created them from nothing must be an uncreated essence, who is and will be for all centuries to come, the Lord and Master of all things, without beginning or end, immutable, whose years cannot be numbers. And I said, therefore there is a creator, else there would have been no creation. So this kind of cosmological argument starts from the observation that the universe exists, and then uses that as evidence to say, well, something must have created this universe, and thus there must be a God to serve as the explanation for what created the universe. All right, so let's break this down a little bit further. So consider our universe that we live in. There's certain things happening right now. There's me yelling about philosophy right now. But there's not just the things happening in the universe right now, there's also the things that will happen in the future. We might represent this with a sort of dotted line to represent those things that haven't happened yet, but will happen as time goes on. But there's also the past. So if I go to the left here, this represents the past. If I go back a couple years, I won't tell you how many, there's me graduating from college. If I go a little bit further back, there's the time in which I was born. But in this universe, even before I was born, there was World War II. And in this universe, even before humans existed on Earth, there were dinosaurs roaming this Earth. There seems to be two ways, though, we could finish our picture of the past of the universe. So, one possibility is maybe the past goes back infinitely. Maybe as you go farther back, no matter how far back you go, maybe you can just keep going farther and farther and farther. We might try to represent that using a picture where the line that goes left into the past, we just draw an arrow at the end of it to represent it just keeps going. Alternatively, it's possible that maybe if we go far enough back in the past, that there's a starting point to the entire universe itself. That there's a point in time we get to that is the very first moment in time, such that there is no moment before that. But which picture is correct? It cannot be both of these ways. And so, do we have reason to believe that we live in a universe with an infinite past, or do we have reason to believe that at some point in the past there's a beginning to the universe? So all of this leads to a central premise in the cosmological argument that's being developed by Yacob in his treatise. And it's the claim that the universe began to exist. That's the kind of universe we live in. But why should we believe this? Isn't it possible that the universe just keeps going back infinitely? The key passage where Yacob defends this premise goes as follows. He says, I must search for the creator of my parents, and of the parents of my parents, until I arrive at the first, who were not created as we are, but who came into this world in some other way without being generated. Now here's the key bold part that I'm emphasizing. For if they themselves have been created, so if my parents or the parents of my parents, if they have been created, if they have a beginning, then I know nothing of their origin unless I say, he who created them from nothing must be an uncreated essence. All right. So the claim here is, when you say that I came from my parents, you haven't actually explained why I exist, because my parents themselves were created. And if I don't have an explanation for them, then they fail to explain why I exist. And so the idea is, in order for there to be an explanation for why I exist, sooner or later I have to trace it back to something that was an uncreated essence. Because it's only then that I actually have an explanation for the entire chain, is the idea. So the claim here is that at any stage in this regress, so if I go back to my parents, if my parents were themselves created, then I haven't yet explained why I exist. And then if you go to, well, my grandparents, well, yet again, if my grandparents were themselves created, then you can ask, well, why did they exist? And so you haven't explained why I exist either. And so the only way you've actually explained why I exist is if you get back to a point where you say, well, I exist because of that thing, and that thing was not created. It's just always been. So this reasoning then appeals to a principle that we can refer to as the principle of causation. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So anything that was created has to have something that caused it to be created, to come into existence. Yacob might actually be appealing to a principle that's a bit stronger than the principle of causation. It's a principle that is famously known as the principle of sufficient reason. And this principle says everything has a sufficient reason for its truth or its existence. We'll talk about this principle later in the semester, but I just want to emphasize we can construct the argument using the principle of causation, but I think Yacob might actually have a stronger idea in the background. Anyways, but why should we believe this principle? Why should we believe that anything with a beginning has to have a cause of its existence? So the principle of causation has traditionally been defended in two ways. The first way is the sort of rationalist way, the one that appeals to our pure reason. It says, using our reason, we can just realize that if something has a beginning, it has to have a cause. When you just think about that idea, you see that it has to be true. It's like thinking of an unmarried bachelor. If you understand what a bachelor is, you'll just know that a bachelor has to be unmarried. If you understand what it means for something to begin to exist, you'll realize that it must have a cause just by thinking about it hard enough. A medieval Islamic philosopher, Al-Ghazali, had a nice presentation of this kind of idea. The claim was something of the form, look, if something begins to exist, that means it hasn't always existed. There was some point at which it was sort of in non-existence, and then some later point at which it did exist. So it went from non-existence to existence. And then he appeals to the sort of idea of sort of analogous to Newton's laws of motion. This idea is something that is at motion will tend to stay in motion unless something acts on it. Something that's at rest will tend to stay at rest unless something acts on it to sort of move it from that state. Similarly, something in non-existence is just going to stay non-existing unless something brings it into existence or acts on it and brings it into the realm of existence. And so anything with a beginning moves from non-existence to existence, and something needs to move it into existence. And that means it must have a cause. The other way to try to defend this principle is by appealing to experience. So this is the empiricist way. It tries to rely on our empirical observations to give evidence for this principle. And this kind of reasoning usually says something in the form, look at all these examples of things that begin to exist. I began to exist, and something caused me to exist. Look at my parents. They began to exist, and something caused them to exist. My computer began to exist. Something caused it to exist. This microphone began to exist, and something caused it to exist. So when I look at, the earth began to exist, and something caused it to begin to exist. So when I look at all of these examples using my observations, using my senses, I come to realize that everything that I've observed with a beginning also has a cause. And thus, since everything I've seen so far has a cause, it's likely that everything that has a beginning has a cause. So Yacob does not explicitly say anything about why he believes this principle is true, that everything needs a cause or everything needs an explanation. However, given his overall framework, it seems as if he might be amenable to option number one, since he's stressing the role of our reason for understanding and gaining knowledge about the world. All right, so putting all these pieces together, here's Yacob's cosmological argument. And this is a very common argument that's been given by many thinkers besides just Yacob. So the idea is whatever begins to exist has a cause to its existence. It didn't just sort of pop into existence spontaneously. But the universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause to its existence. And that cause is what Jacob's then going to call God. Right, so here's a couple worries, though, for that argument. First, why can't the series of causes stretch back infinitely? If the series were infinite, then it seems every item that came into existence in the chain would in fact have a cause, and we wouldn't violate the principle of causation. So, if time is infinite, if the past is infinite, then any particular thing I pick in that chain does in fact have a cause. And so it's explained by that. So every individual thing gets an explanation. But Yacob replies, look, I know nothing of their origin unless I say he who created them must be an uncreated essence. So Jacob's claim here is this idea that, look, it can't go back infinitely, because if each of those things is created, at no point in the chain have you actually explained why I exist. Since as you keep going back further, you just sort of ask why. So why do I exist? Well, because my parents created me. Well, why did my parents exist? Because their parents created them. And that is, but until you explain why my parents exist or why my grandparents exist, you haven't explained why I exist. And so the idea is merely pushing this back to infinity doesn't help get an explanation of why I exist. And so it looks like we need something that is uncreated, a sort of first cause to all of it. So one worry with this is just, hold on, why should I believe that the past can't be infinite? If the series were infinite, then any particular item in the chain would in fact have a cause. So my parents have my grandparents as their cause. My grandparents have their parents as their cause. And I can keep going back. And if this goes back forever, I never reach anything in the chain that doesn't have an explanation. It's just the thing right before it. And that has an explanation too, the thing right before it that caused it to exist. And so thinking that the universe has an infinite past doesn't violate this principle of causation. But Yacob says, I know nothing of their origin unless I say he who created them must be an uncreated essence. So it seems that Yacob here is suggesting that even if the past went back infinitely, that still wouldn't be good enough, because no matter how far back you go in that infinite chain, you never arrive at an explanation for the original fact of why I or why my parents exist. So the claim here is, look, I want to know why I exist. And you say, well, because of my parents. But the idea is, you haven't explained why I exist if I don't know why my parents exist. And then you say, well, because my grandparents exist. Well, yet again, you still haven't explained at all why I exist if you don't explain why my grandparents exist. And the idea is just keeping going back further, making this chain infinite. If everything there is created, then there's no explanation for why I exist, even if the chain is infinite. So at some point, what we really need in order to actually get an explanation at all for why I exist is somewhere in this chain there has to be an uncreated sort of essence, as he says. So this is why I'm tempted to say that Jacob's appealing to a stronger principle of sufficient reason. So it's not just that I need a cause to my existence. It seems like he might be willing to say there needs to be a sufficient reason for why I exist, to explain why I exist rather than that I don't. And a mere cause from my parents is not enough to sufficiently explain why I exist. Here's another worry, though. Isn't it at least conceivable that something come into existence spontaneously without a cause or without any explanation? Now, this is certainly weird to think that something could just pop into existence and there's no explanation, there's no cause to it. But it certainly doesn't seem inconceivable. Being strange and weird and hard to understand is not the same thing as literally unintelligible. Look, I think a square circle is inconceivable. But something popping into existence spontaneously without any explanation, that does strike me as strange and weird, but it doesn't seem like there's any contradiction in that claim, like there is with the claim of a married bachelor or in a square circle. And so why should I think that this is really impossible? Here's a response, though, that someone might give. They might say, look, Sam, you're right. It's strange and weird. We've never seen anything just spontaneously pop into existence. And now, this is where the empirical defense, the principle of causation, might come in. So even if it is conceivable of something spontaneously sort of being created without any explanation, even if that's possible and conceivable, we shouldn't think that that's likely to be the case with the universe itself, since this is strange and weird and we've never seen it happen. But here's a further objection. Yes, it's strange and weird when we consider our experience with items that have come into existence inside the universe. So when I think about things like me, this microphone, you, my parents, tables, chairs, computers, all of those things that came into existence had a cause. I don't just see computers pop into existence without a cause. However, we shouldn't think that this principle that holds true inside the universe is thereby representative of a principle that applies to the universe itself or outside the universe. So the claim here is just, why should I think that the rules that apply in the universe also apply to the universe as a whole itself? It seems as if I'm working on a biased sample. All the things that I can observe are parts of the universe. Why should I think that what's true about the parts of the universe is going to be similarly true about the universe as a whole? Here's a third worry. Even if this gets you a first cause, why should we think that the cause needs to be God? It seems like a big leap from the claim that there's a first cause to the claim that an infinite or perfect person exists that's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, etc. So this was often thought to be, so theologians have often charged philosophical arguments for the existence of God and say, look, this is the God of the philosophers. You can get like a first cause, but you can't get the sort of theistic, maybe Islamic or Christian or Judaic conception of God. Yacob does try to fill in the gaps here a little bit. He says on page 233 in our translation, well, the Creator who endowed us with the gifts of intelligence and reason cannot himself be without them, for he created us as intelligent beings from the abundance of his intelligence, and the same one being comprehends all, creates all, is almighty. So he tries to say there's something in the nature of what was created by this first cause that gives us evidence about the features of the cause. So the claim is when we look at the universe, look, we have intelligence. Look at the complexity of all the things that were created by God. And it seems like anything that is able to create all that must have some sort of intelligence in order to create intelligent creatures, or must also be very powerful to create all these things. Yet again there, it's not clear that you get all the way to anything like an all-powerful or all-knowing God. But now notice, remember, Yacob was not defending any particular religion. He only wanted to hold religious beliefs that he could vindicate using his own individual reason. And so he might not be worried about this kind of objection, because he's not here necessarily to defend the Christian faith or the Islamic faith or the Jewish faith in particular. And so he might say, look, this is all I can get. I can get an intelligent, powerful creator of the universe, but I can't necessarily get the Christian God or the Islamic God or the Judaic God. If that's all my reason gets me, then that's all I'll believe. Maybe he would be okay with that, but it's hard to tell. So that's all for this video. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.